Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janice Perino, and I'll be chairing the meeting for this afternoon. Our clerk this afternoon is Ms. Sheila Gurry. I'd like to call this Governance and Priorities Committee meeting to order. And good afternoon. Welcome to the December 9th Governance and Priorities Committee meeting. I'd like to first recognize that we are on the traditional territory of the Sanamwa First Nation. We also have we have several councillors actually that are on attending electronically, Councillor Manley and Councillor Eastmore. Today's Governance and Priorities Committee meeting will be held in accordance with the Community Charter and the Council Procedure Bylaw 2018, number 7272. If during the meeting any member of the gallery has a question on a matter that is considered by the committee today, please sign up on the sheet located on the table by the double doors to my left. Please note that the Council Procedure Bylaw has been updated, so questions will only be taken on staff reports or other business items. Before we start the meeting, I would like to take a few moments to remind those who are in attendance in person about the rules of decorum for all council and committee meetings. A meeting of council and a committee is intended to be a place where democracy can freely take place in a respectful and safe manner. The council chambers is a workplace, and there are considerations council and staff must make to ensure that a safe work environment exists in accordance with WorkSafe BC regulations. To support this, disrespectful conduct will not be tolerated, so we ask that there will be no cheering or jeering or other outbursts from the gallery at any time. This will ensure that everyone has an opportunity to speak, whether it be a delegation, a member of council, or staff, that they are not interrupted and can make their point freely without distraction or fear of ridicule. In incidences where a speaker is being inappropriate or has exceeded their time limit, their microphone will be shut off. Similarly, if there are any outbursts by any person in the gallery, they will be asked to stop, and if they do not comply, they may be asked to leave as permitted under Section 133 of the Community Charter. If necessary, council may call a recess in order to reset the environment of the council chambers. It is our belief that if everyone is respectful of these basic considerations, this meeting and future meetings will be more effective in furthering the business of the City of Nanaimo. The first item on the agenda is the introduction of late items. Ms. Gurry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For late items today, we have Agenda Item 6A1, Nanaimo Parking Review and Bylaw Update, Parking's Condition Report. We are removing the presenter, Caroline Deneau, Transportation Planner from Urban Systems. And the second item is for Agenda Item 6A2, updating off-street parking requirements downtown. We're adding a delegation from Darren Moss. And that's it, Madam Chair.
Thank you. May I have a motion for the adoption of the agenda? Moved by Councillor Thorpe and seconded by Mayor Croak. All those in favor? No one's opposed? Thank you. It's carried. Motion for adoption of the minutes is circulated. Moved by Councillor Hemmings, seconded by Councillor Armstrong. Any questions? No one? All those in favor? No one's opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you. Agenda planning. Ms. Gurry, will you take us through the upcoming topics and initiatives?
Yes, thank you again, Madam Chair. So listed in your agenda is a list of upcoming topics and initiatives for future GPCs. The dates are to be determined, and on the second page lists the dates in starting in January for 2025 of the Governance and Priorities Committee meetings. So there is scheduled meeting January 27th, February 10th, March 10th, March 24th, and a list of upcoming topics that will be and have already been approved by the committee to go forward to a future GPC. So they will be on a future GPC agenda. Not listed is a one staff initiative, and I believe Councillor Gesselbrock has one that he would like to bring forward as well. A staff initiative to be determined, a date to be determined, is that the committee will consider the phasing and timing of design commercial, including the work fronting Diana Krall Plaza. Staff would like to bring that forward sometime in the first quarter of 2025. So if there could be a motion for that to be an upcoming topic, that would be wonderful.
Comments? Move the motion. Councillor Gesselbrock moved the motion. Councillor Hemmings seconded it. Any questions? Comments? Okay, It's okay? All right, all those in favor? No one's opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you. And we have as well Councillor Guestbrook?
Yeah, thanks.
If you just need to, I think you should be on.
Okay, I'm on now, thanks. Yeah, I brought this up last GPC and in questions. It's regarding the deconstruction and demolition bylaw that's on our integrated action plan. So it's back and forth with our CAO and how to move this forward. And so I'd like to move that in accordance with IAP item C1612, that the topic of demolition and deconstruction bylaw to increase the diversion of recyclable and reusable material from landfill be placed on an upcoming GPC agenda before the end of Q2 2025, and that staff prepare a report on existing deconstruction bylaws, key elements and a draft D&D bylaw, key elements of a draft D&D bylaw, and the challenges and opportunities for regulating deconstruction in Nanaimo, and that the report includes options for council to consider for proceeding with the drafting of a demolition and deconstruction bylaw.
Seconded by Councillor Hemmings. Comments? Councillor Armstrong. Gotcha. Can you tell this is a little bit of a learning process? Thank you.
Thank you. My question is through to staff. Is there any look at, is there going to be provincial laws coming in this? Do you know? And secondly, if not, do you have the capacity to do that at this particular time?
Through the chair to Councillor Armstrong, I'm not aware of any provincial legislation forthcoming on deconstruction, but it just is my lack of awareness on it. It could be on the horizon. Staff capacity is another issue for sure. I think the two-stepping this through a discussion at GPC is possible. I'm hopeful that on the sanitation side of house we'll have Taj back in his seat in the new year here, but that remains to be seen. And I think on the development or the services side of house, which will also be involved in the permitting side, I think with the housing bylaw is also creating some constraints, but I'll let Mr. Holmes speak to that.
Yeah, thanks, and through the chair. So on the staffing side and the capacity side, definitely will be a challenge. There's going to be a need, obviously, to engage with industry and to carefully consider the implications of such a bylaw, and obviously it's going to require working with industry and ensuring that the environment is in place to ensure that such a program would be successful. There's going to be, bringing the item forward, we can definitely do our best to bring it forward within that timeline. It will be challenging with other work ongoing, and then we'll have to be very mindful of the administrative burden that such a bylaw would put on approvals, both on the city side and on the industry side. Those are just, those will come up through discussion. Those issues will come up through discussion and conversation, I would imagine, around the GPC table in the future, but just a couple of items to highlight. So it's definitely possible, but will be challenging. So.
Thank you. Just to add further to that, having met with the Builders Association and being at their supper, a lot of concerns about delays right now coming, no offense, because I know there's staffing capacity issues coming out on permit times, et cetera, et cetera. So I really don't want to see building development slide to the back when I believe this can wait. So right now, I think the timing is off for me. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Hemmings?
Thank you, Chair. Speaking in support, I think it's timely, and I also think many of the questions that were asked are questions that will be addressed in the staff report for our consideration. So when it comes to GPC, we will consider things such as staff capacity and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm in support of getting the report and having the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see it up on the list, but Mayor Krog?
Thank you, Chair. I did press it. It does look green. In any event, my concern is the timing. Candidly, throughout history, when it's come to deconstruction of whatever existed, it's been done in a way because it matched economic need and made economic sense. Whether you're tearing stones and covers off the pyramids thousands of years ago, or taking down ancient structures because of the quality of timber, and I'm certainly familiar with some of the exquisite clear fir that exists in many of the buildings in our community. But having said that, if the market isn't there to provide a place to dispose of what you've carefully deconstructed, then you're looking at regulation and essentially subsidy, which will have the impact of driving up the cost of the new construction that you're undertaking and the cost of housing. And so for me, it's not a question of being opposed to the philosophy, it's a question of whether, given what we've heard from staff, this is the timing for this city to do it, as opposed to seeing if some other cities have implemented it and what has been the reaction and success there. You know, companies like Demex are expanding and doing well, but they're a bit of an exception in the marketplace. So I'm interested to hear the other councillors today, but my inclination is that this is something perhaps for next year, so to speak, but not right now, not when the construction industry in particular has been faced with changes to the building code, changes around heating requirements, electrification, the whole issue of the province in Bill 44, 46, 47, whatever, et cetera. There's only so much change any sector of an economy can handle at one point, and I don't know that I want to send staff down the road on something that would require extensive, in fairness, extensive consultation.
Councillor Gesselbrock?
Thanks. See, council is keen to debate the implementation of a bylaw without really understanding too much, what are the various options for it. In some places, there's just a request that when a building is demolition, that 10% of the material, which is the wood, gets put in a bin and moved to recycling, at the very low bar. So I wouldn't get too lost in the terminology of deconstruction. It's a deconstruction demolition bylaw that's going to look at what we can do to divert some material that's usable or recyclable out of the landfill. And there's two items that are happening right now that does make this very timely. One is that the RDN is putting a levy on all waste that's generated in the region, which means that when you haul that waste, you get charged per ton. And so there's an economic incentive now for haulers, and that cost gets put onto the actual producer of the waste to reduce the amount of waste that actually goes to the landfill. So there's an economic incentive already built in the regional district to move in this direction. Also, I met with all the members from each regional district on the island and also in the coastal region. And the average amount of landfill space that we currently have is about 21 years on average per regional district. If we pooled all our resources, that means that we'd ship waste from each regional district and filled up, we'd have about 35 years of landfill space. One single disaster could reduce that landfill space by up to a decade. So we're facing a huge crunch in terms of our landfill. That's about $120 per ton that we're paying for a landfill space. So siting a new landfill is very tricky, costly, and probably something that would take a lot longer to do. So there's a lot of impending factors that are currently happening right now. Another one too, which is going to accelerate the amount of landfill space being taken up, is Bill C-44, which is going to allow to have up to four different units on a current single family space. That could lead to a lot of demolition of single family homes in the upcoming decade. So it's timely to get something in place now that is going to incentivize and promote moving materials, diverting it from landfill. And I can definitely understand, the building sector is continually under changes. We can't build the same buildings that we did in 1960, and so it's an evolving space. I think there's a lot that we can do on our end if timelines for permitting is an issue to reduce those timelines. We've got a certified professional program. We're waiting on getting computer software to be able to track and make it more seamless, sort of the permitting process. And these are all things that we can choose to accelerate. This particular item has been on the books as a priority item now for 2 years at the beginning of our IAP, which we all voted on, and we're about halfway through. The way that the motion is worded is it's two-step. We're not immediately putting a bylaw in place. We're getting staff to bring us forward options. It's something that one of our managers of of Solid Waste here has already been investigating, although they've been on leave for a little bit, and hopefully that capacity will come back. But if you look at the timeline that it would take to even start to dig into this, this term will be over. And so this is brought forward now to begin that process, and it doesn't wed us to pursuing any particular path, but we should have a discussion on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sims, if I could just ask you a question now. I'm just wondering, or Mr. Holmes, whoever feels this answer is, or this question is for them. You've been studying this for a long time, so this is not a new question, is that correct? This is nothing new.
Chair, it's nothing new. But I don't have a lot of expertise in it myself, and I would want to defer to staff in this for sure.
So we're looking at bringing this forward to a GPC, maybe late February, March. Does that give time?
Just, Madam Chair, just for clarification, I think it was the end
Q2?
of Q2, so.
Okay. Does that give you the time that you need?
To have the discussion, I think so. We'd have to engage with some of our partners. For example, Councillor Gesselbrecht had referenced the regional district. Obviously, they're a key player in waste management in the region, as well as Mr. Sims had mentioned. Staff key to the project are on leave currently.
Okay.
But to bring the discussion forward with some options for consideration, depending on if serious engagement and development of a bylaw were to follow,
Okay.
Rather than as it's been suggested, it's a two-phase project. I think it is feasible.
Okay.
As the mayor mentioned, there's a lot of change happening as well. There's an updated there's an update to the building code in March. Another update that staff are working with some major projects on the horizon. So workload is a challenge, but I think we could definitely bring something forward for discussion within that time frame. Thanks.
Okay. Councillor Armstrong?
Thank you. I'm just wondering if Councillor Giselbrecht would be amenable to change it to Q3, which gives them more time to work on the projects they already have. And then it still gives us more time because it would come back to us in September or October. I'm just really concerned about the staff capacity. As we've heard, they don't have the capacity to do it. Something is going to fall through the cracks.
Councillor Gesselbrecht?
I appreciate that. I have been going back and forth with our CAO on this, discussing timelines and whether the end of Q2 is feasible. And I think it's reasonable, 6 months, to be able to pull something together. And if it's not, I'm completely okay with staff coming back and like, listen, we got fried on these updates and we're not going to be able to get this back by this time, and give us an update. That's okay. But I think setting timelines, just exactly like we did, by setting this as a priority item in our 4-year plan, that it's fair. And yeah, if it comes Q3, it's not the end of the thing, but I think setting a goal at the end of Q2, which is June, is reasonable. Thank you.
Councillor Thorpe?
But it's not.
Thanks. I'll try to be fairly laconic. I agree with the earlier comments of the mayor, and I'm not opposed to this, but I don't share Councillor Gesselbrecht's concern about the rush on timing, and I am very cognizant of the demands on our staff time, and also the upheaval that's happening in the construction industry right now. And I think this is a big topic which is going to take a lot of research and consultation, and I'm interested in pursuing it, but I'm not going to support this short timeline.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, we've talked about this quite a bit. We'll call the vote. All those in favor?
The timeline drives me crazy, but I'll support it.
Councillor Gesselbrecht, Councillor Hemmings, Mayor Krogh, Councillor Eastmere, and Councillor Manley, and those opposed? Councillor Armstrong, Perino, and Thorpe. Motion's carried. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to reports. First report is the Nanaimo Parking Review and Bylaw Update Parking Conditions Report, to be introduced by Mr. Sims.
Thank you very much, Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm just really interested in my own experience here at the city. In municipal government, there's nothing quite so sensitive as parking, unless it's garbage pickup. So I think there's an interesting balance between the two. as you're aware, City Plan, the Integrated Action Plan, put managing parking citywide as a priority. And so this today is sort of the introduction, one of several interactions that council and the public will have with that topic of managing parking citywide. So we've engaged Urban Systems who, similar, you recall Mr. Rosen talking about the expertise of that team in DCC bylaws, the expertise in Urban Systems for transportation planning and land use planning is also well known across the province. And this could easily be my colleague Mr. Holm introducing this, or Ms. Rowett introducing this, because we've, as early as the Transportation Master Plan in 2014, land use is transportation is land use. So they're very intertwined. Yeah. So the first of two reports in front of you today, this is to sort of set the stage for the study that Urban Systems is undertaking around this concept of managing parking in citywide. And we're very mindful, and you'll hopefully, if you took the time to read the 80-page report that was attached to your agenda, you'll see the nuance that is sort of all tangled up between land use, parking, and mobility. And that's what we're trying to get right in this. And of course, the second stage of this is on the transportation-oriented areas of the TOAs, specifically the downtown, and the discussion around reducing or eliminating parking minimums. So that's, we can talk about that when we get there, but this really is to set the stage for the overall citywide management of parking.
Okay.
So I'll pass it over to Mr. Bailey.
Mr. Casey, nice to have you here. You'll be speaking, and you are the transportation consultant from Urban Systems. Nice to have you. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Very happy and appreciative to be here. So I'm going to spend about 15 minutes or so providing an overview of the project we have in front of us, talk a little bit about our first phase and kind of key findings from that work. And then we want to speak just a little bit to some of the kind of emerging directions that have come out of that and where this project might
Mr.
go.
Casey, did you want questions throughout or at the end?
I think I'm flexible. I think, I suppose the preference is to work through the material, and then I'll be here for as long as is needed to engage in questions.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Okay, so why the parking review and bylaw update? The crux of this work really is around alignment of your parking regulations with some of your higher level policies, primarily driven by City Plan. There's an element of this where we know, and you've already taken some steps, that provincial legislative change over the last year or so has resulted in change to your own regulations, but there's still a process of understanding sort of what comes next and what the impacts of those this sort of new approach to development and parking might look like. So we're going to sort of focus in on that area as well. And then lastly, we know, and I'll provide a little bit of information here, and I think the group's already relatively up to speed on this, is the impacts of parking and the way that parking is provided and then managed are quite broad. And so we do want to investigate opportunities beyond simply parking and sort of how we can achieve some of the city's broad objectives through management and regulation of parking. Our outcomes, we are working towards some fairly focused outcomes. Those are recommendations and changes for some of your key regulatory documents. It would undersimplify the exercise to just say we're going to jump into these documents and make changes. There's quite a bit of analysis and thinking and conversation that will happen along the way. Our targeted outcomes in the end are recommended changes to your off-street parking regulations bylaw, your traffic and highways regulation bylaw, your crossing control bylaw, and anything else that sort of we uncover along the way, regulation-wise, that might require change. The generalized process is on the screen in front of us. We're undertaking this in 4 phases. The first phase is around background review and issue identification. The summary report that's in your agenda package is the key outcome from this phase 1 of work. We've started to turn our attention to phase 2, which is engagement and conversation, as well as assessment of some of the opportunities for some of the sort of the bigger items for change, and I'll highlight some of where we see that might go for phase 2 a little later on. But this is really the point we're at right now. Subsequent to this, phase 3 is around confirming and solidifying the recommendations where change might need to come in regulation. And then phase 4 will actually be the reworking and edits to the regulatory documents themselves. So our starting point is city plan. Your official community, we do this work in other communities too. Your official community plan is great, and it's recent, and it gives us a really good foundation for the work we're doing here. So we want to sort of do justice and give credence to some of the policy direction that's contained in city plan. And we think there's a number of areas where through parking regulation, we can make real positive, impactful change toward those key directions. So on the screen in front of us is straight from city plan. It's the Nanaimo donut. There's five key city goals. Those are green Nanaimo, connected Nanaimo, healthy Nanaimo, empowered Nanaimo, and prosperous Nanaimo. And then in city plan, within each of those, there's a whole series of policy topic areas. And so this is sort of where we get a little bit more focused in terms of some of the subject matter where parking regulation and our manipulation and reworking of that to better reflect current policy directions can have meaningful impacts. We've just highlighted some of those. This is by no means limiting, and admittedly, this is still at quite a high level. But some of the areas where parking regulatory change could provide broader benefit is around sustainable transportation and green mobility, around GHG emissions reduction, new housing and more affordable housing, access, safety, complete streets, et cetera. So there's really a broad range of potential positive impacts from this work, and specifically from the parking regulatory changes that might come from it. We are seeing, when we look in city plan, we also look at the direction that's been in place in your transportation master plan for about a decade now. We are seeing some real key areas where we think the policy guidance is going to steer this work. Those kind of general areas or density and housing focused in designated locations, we're seeing real strong guidance through city plan to focus intensity and focus new housing in defined urban centers. We're seeing sort of reinforcement of that more recently through provincial legislative change. We're seeing language in city plan and even previously in the transportation master plan about right-sizing parking solutions. So we interpret right-sizing as being not too much, not too little, trying to find the sort of the quantity and supply that's right. And then 3, around a prioritization of sustainable transportation. And so that might seem different than sort of what is core to parking subject matter, but the reality is parking and this sort of more complete mobility package, the full picture of how people move about, they're directly linked. And so that's going to be an important piece of what we're doing here as well. A couple policy quotes straight out of city plan. I'll just kind of read through a couple of them here, the key points. We're seeing policy direction to manage citywide parking with a focus on right-sizing parking. We're seeing policy support for removal of off-street parking minimums specific to the downtown. And so I understand our second item after this one is addressing that item head on. We see policy direction around encouraging the development of affordable and accessible rental and owned housing units, considering also parking relaxations to help make this viable. And then we're seeing prioritize expansion and enhancement of walking, rolling, cycling, and transit routes to create an integrated mobility network. So a lot of very specific city plan policy references to some of those broader policy goals that I introduced just a second ago. So generally within the last year, there's reference to it a few minutes ago as well as some very important legislative changes at the provincial level. And so the impacts of that are quite broad beyond parking. Really the crux of it is around increased housing and housing affordability. But they also have impacts on parking provision. So Bill 44 is a small-scale multi-unit housing legislative bill. It had pieces in there around reduction of minimums in areas where small-scale multi-unit housing is proximate to transit. Bill 47 was the TOAs, the transit-oriented areas, and so that legislated that for those locations that have been identified provincially as identified TOAs, that there'd be no allowable minimum requirement for residential uses in those areas. You have 3 of them, and you've already made the regulatory changes to put that into action. And the third ones came along more recently is Bill 16. Bill 16, my understanding was it was actually more focused on tenant protection, but in there was a lever around the opportunity for local governments to require and mandate transportation demand management, so alternative transportation options in development and regulation. And so that's something we want to give good consideration to here in the work we're doing. So the background document that's in your agenda package is 80 or so pages, and it's kind of a background review of generally the current state of both off-street and on-street and public parking in the city. I'm just going to spend a couple minutes here touching on some of the, I guess, higher-level key takeaways. And this is by no means all that's contained in that document, but just some of the highlights. So the city's approach to minimum parking supply requirements for multifamily residential. I understand there was a change that occurred in 2018 with a focus on a sort of a tiered approach, where generally the more urban and dense areas of the community would have a lower multifamily residential parking requirement. It's actually an excellent framework for approaching multifamily requirements, and something that other communities have actually used as kind of a best practice or precedent for exploring similar things in their communities. So it's a great thing to continue to push forward on, but some of the policy directions through city plan have since come along since this work was done, and we've seen fairly significant legislative changes at the provincial level. So we want to investigate that quite closely as part of this process. You have taken the steps to eliminate minimum parking requirements for multifamily residential in your transit-oriented areas. That's kind of a key piece of change over the past year. You've got a shared parking regulation in your off-street parking requirements, which is a great way to better match a site's parking needs with the regulations that are in place. So this applies to sites where it might be say multifamily residential and a commercial or an institutional use. So that's a great thing, something we're going to want to pull forward as part of this work and investigate to make sure it is resulting in the intended outcome. And then one other item we want to touch on is your cash in lieu of parking policy. You have one. It's relatively confined in terms of geographic application. And we sort of, in looking back on the uptake and use of it by the development community over the past few years, we're not seeing very high uptake, especially as compared to some other similar type municipalities where it's commonplace that cash in lieu is quite often leveraged as an opportunity for flexibility as applications come forward.
Mr. Casey, can you hold on for a question Mayor Croak has?
Thank you very much. Is it if that's seen as a failure, is it the failure of our policy, or is it the difference between communities? If you could just explain that a little further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I can't say for certain whether it's a failure and what the cause of that is, but we do see it utilized more commonly in other communities where either it's a variance request on the minimum requirement, or at the applicant's discretion, it's use of the cash in lieu. My feeling is that you have geographic extents where the cash in lieu is applicable, and it doesn't take in all that much of the city, so that's probably one of the key limiting pieces. I think what we've also seen is where cash in lieu contributions have been made. What we're seeing in other communities is that can come part and parcel with contribution to sustainable transportation options, which we're not seeing sort of that being part of the common practice here. Yeah, so it is something we do want to unpack. There's, you know, in a world where minimum parking requirements are set at a level that they're accepted by the development community, there is no need to leverage a cash in lieu opportunity. So potentially that's part of the equation here as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Keep going.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah. Some more observations. So you've got regulation in place to ensure the provision and adequate design of some of these supporting parking and active transportation facility types. So you've got accessible regulations in place, both on the supply of accessible parking and the design of those facilities. You've got EV charging requirements in place, which is excellent. You've got loading, and you've got bicycle parking requirements. With each of these, we're seeing it's great that each of these items has been included in regulation, and it's the right thing to be doing. And quite frankly, not every other community has all of these addressed in regulation, but we're seeing areas within each of these where there's opportunity for improvement. So we do want to, as part of the conversation, sort of the options testing as we move forward, tease out what some of those opportunities might be. We actually sort of rounded the corner in our background reporting, and there's a little piece in the back that highlights where some of that potential change could be. And then I guess lastly, more specific to public parking, the emphasis of this exercise is on parking regulation, and a large part of that is going to be regulation of parking associated with private development through your land use regulations. But we want to make sure that some of the changes, for example, with recent legislation, they're significant. And some of the changes we might entertain through this process might also be significant. So we do want to make sure that as we're entertaining these changes in off-street parking regulation, that we're also mindful of what the potential impact might be on on-street and public parking, and any sort of proactive, whether it's in place from day one, or whether it's being mindful that change might need to occur on that side also into the future. We want to be eyes wide open to that as we work through this, so there'll be a component of that as well. And so what we are noticing in your community is the emphasis on public parking management is quite, correctly, is in the downtown, and then in and around primarily the hospital and VIU to an extent as well. And so that's our starting point. But when we start to entertain what off-street regulation, how it might change in future, we want to be mindful of that might spread broader than just these areas that are managed now, and be aware of the public management that might need to occur as well. Okay, so yeah, I encourage everyone to, if you haven't already, have a look through that background document that's in the agenda package. Everything I just touched on, there's that in there and more, and it's quite in depth. And so that's really kind of our foundation for an outcome for the stage one of work. And then we're starting to move forward into phase two in terms of teasing out what some of those key directions might be. So I did want to take the opportunity while I was here. We haven't really gotten to the point where we've gone into any great level of detail, but all of the background research and analysis really is pointing us into a handful of key directions. And so wanted to take the opportunity to float those with the committee. So area one is really around parking supply requirements. We're going to talk a little bit more about this with the next agenda item as well. One of probably the key emerging direction, and there's city plan policy to support it, is the need for parking supply requirements to really match some of the policy directions that are in place. So probably the key one is around your land use designations and your approach to urban centers. So the map on the screen in front of us is out of city plan. It's your primary urban center, your downtown, and your secondary urban centers. This is our starting point for entertaining where some of those big moves might occur in terms of reductions or change in minimum parking supply requirements. So your three legislated TOA areas are University, Country Club, and Woodgrove. You've made the parking regulatory change to eliminate minimum parking requirements for multifamily residential in these areas. This is, we'll call it an early step. Subsequent step that's being entertained.
Can you hold on? Councillor Armstrong, please.
Yeah, I just have a question on when you're going to the transit-oriented areas. I was talking to the developer that's doing the one behind Mary Ellen Drive there, which is at a transit hub, whatever. They don't have enough parking. And they came to the city and wanted more parking and were denied. So can you address that? Because they're very concerned, because some of them are sitting empty because people want their cars there.
Yeah, I can provide thoughts. I think this is a conversation around minimum parking requirements. So they're saying that essentially that you can provide zero in these areas. They aren't necessarily capping how high you might go with your parking provision. So there's still a little bit of I guess faith in the market, in the development community, that the parking that's going to be provided might still meet the needs of that site. But to your point, the elimination of minimums does mean there's a potential for some very low parked buildings.
I guess my concern is we have a maximum, and they were quite concerned because they're struggling because they don't have enough parking. And that was borne out by their first phase where now people are parking in the mall, and now they're gonna be starting to get towed, so just something to think about. That's, I'll bring that up later. I just wondered if you would talk to them to hear their concerns.
Yeah, we could.
I think, Mr. Lindsay, did you want to respond?
Just from what I know of that project, and just so council's clear, it's not that we have a parking maximum. The issue on that site was that there was other driving factors, including the requirement for open space provision requirements, stormwater management. So there's other competing issues that resulted in a limit of the amount of parking that could be provided as surface parking. There could have been additional underground parking had that been their choice, but
Thank
obviously
you for clarification.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Casey.
Great, and good question, yeah. Okay, so next logical step would be your primary urban center, which is your downtown, and I know we're going to talk about that in a minute, but for elimination of minimums in some of the legislated TOAs, that might logically extend to your downtown. Thirdly, city plan really does consider each of the secondary growth centers to be sort of like, from a policy perspective, treated the same, treated equally. And so brings then the question of, might we apply similar regulatory change that's been made to the TOAs to the remaining secondary urban centers? And then lastly, it brings in the question of, what about the rest of the city? And so there's a conversation to be had there around, are we entertaining parking relaxations? Is this a residential or multi-family residential focused application only, or might it be more broadly? Or might we want to tailor it to respond to some of the sort of like the more secondary neighborhood centers, or even where we know transit service is best, and the expectation is that more people might ride the bus and therefore might benefit from less parking. I don't have answers on that, but it's a conversation we'll be wanting to entertain as we move forward. Item 2, so item 1 was really around parking provision. Item 2 is the corresponding aspect of trying to prepare neighborhoods, communities that provide complete mobility. So this idea that provision of parking and provision of alternatives really should work hand in hand with one another. So we do want to explore in areas where parking provision might be less, how do we ensure that those supporting alternatives are in place to make sure people can still get around? And so this term of complete mobility is something that we want to bring forward as part of this work. And specifically to sort of this line of thinking, opportunities might be to tailor the parking requirements based on access to mobility. So access to higher order transit might be a great example, where parking needs in those areas might actually be less than otherwise, and we might want to make parking requirements match that. Bicycle parking is another one. You have bicycle parking rates in place, but there might be some consideration to increasing those in areas where we know parking provision might be less, again, trying to achieve that complete mobility. There's opportunities to go beyond simply bike parking in terms of regulations that can support people engaging in active transportation. Endpoint cycling facilities is an example. Lockers, change rooms, things like that to support people who commute by bike and making sure their experience is comfortable. Requirements for transportation demand management. So TDM is kind of a reference to policies and programs that support people traveling by sustainable travel options. So that might include things like incentives for financial incentives for people to use transit. Might be create a supportive environment to allow for a car share service to kind of take foot here. Might be supports for bike sharing that's in place, these sorts of things. So there's the opportunity again where we know that parking provision might be lower, is to sort of ramp up the alternatives to make sure people still have complete mobility options. And I think lastly, I touched on this earlier, but this exercise really is focused on parking regulation, and that needs to logically extend to how we approach public parking management. And so especially in areas where we know we're going to create sort of development types that support a lower parking provision, we do want to make sure we're ready, eyes wide open, to what might need to be done with public resource as a result. And so I think one of the key concepts we wanted to introduce here is the idea of curbside management, where traditionally, and this is maybe a slight oversimplification, but curb space has been used for on-street parking primarily, and there's variations on that, but we want to kind of reset that conversation and make it a conversation around curb space and the idea that this is a public resource that can be used for the kind of the greatest benefit and best use by the community. So that necessarily needs to include consideration for on-street parking, but it might also take in a broader conversation around things like providing access for a whole range of people and even delivery of goods. Some of your objectives around urban green space and sort of placemaking and that sort of thing. Objectives also around active transportation. I think the ability to either in a spot location or in a more linear fashion repurpose curb space to support some of those activities as well.
Mr. Casey, we have another question by Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. This is something I'm very interested in and have done a lot of research, and want to thank Strong Towns for a lot of the information they sent me. It was very valuable. One of the questions I get from public is, especially in new subdivisions, they're actually paying for the roads, not the city. So they're paying through their increased house costs. And now they're paying the price for people who don't have parking to come park on the streets. We hear the argument that the city maintains the streets. The argument I get back, haven't seen plow, maybe once, if in every 2 or 3 years, have not seen any road maintenance because our roads are still good, and you expect a residential road to last a lot longer than a main commercial. So they're now feeling that we're subsidizing people that don't want to pay for parking, but they're parking on our streets. Can you comment on that, what your thoughts are, or any research you may have seen on that? Because I can't find a lot of research on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's something behind that. There is, it's kind of I would say a jump to that conclusion that there's a subsidy in place here, but behind that is a truth that some people are benefiting from this public resource and others are not. And so that's where I think when that starts to become a problem and it is preventing access to that resource that certain people should benefit from, that's where the need for management comes in. I think what's important is that as a public resource, either publicly and or privately, usually a combination of both, that's how that capital, that asset was put into place in the first place. There's that, but then over time, as there becomes more of a crunch for that resource, there's added costs that comes with the management that might be need to put in place. So I think it's important that piece is important. It's not just the one-time cost of the infrastructure, it's the ongoing management that might need to occur as well. And that's something we do want to, it's a very difficult thing to put an actual cost figure to. It's sort of, it can be infinite, but something we definitely need to be aware of as new development forms come in, new pressures come in on the street, is being mindful of that added cost.
Yeah, I also use the argument, perhaps you shouldn't use your garage for storage. Maybe that's where your vehicle should go.
Thank you, Mr. Casey. I'll let you keep going.
I do.
And you know what? This was the last slide I had. So I'll conclude with that and say thank you, everyone. I'm very happy to answer any questions and engage in conversation.
Thank you so much. Questions of council? You've asked yours? Okay. Of our two that are on electronic, anything there that? Okay, I don't see any questions, so thank you very much, Mr. Casey. Don't go too far. There's another section of this. Gotcha. I'm sure you'll be back up again. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back over to Mr. Sims to take us through the next.
Thanks, Chair. I think maybe I'll ask Mr. Rose and Ms. Rowett to touch base and introduce the next subject on this one.
Great.
So hopefully that was helpful. One quick note in response to what Councillor Armstrong said was that in our asset management plan, the value of asphalt alone is about $400 million. So this has been, many sources of investment that have built the roads that now a number of people, as Mr. Casey said, have to take advantage of the curb space on, and so are we building asphalt roads for parking, for the convenience of the public? And in some cases it works for sure, but in other cases, managing that very valuable, very expensive curb space is, in the public realm is pretty critical.
Very expensive, that's for sure. Mr. Rose?
Excuse me, thank you very much, Chair. So Mr. Casey's hopefully provided a lot of information to kind of get the discussion around parking management across the city started. I think it highlights how complex and yet nuanced the whole equation is. And we often get into the conversation around the economics of it. And it's just a very complicated task. And the impacts of decisions made at an early stage can have quite a long-lasting impact. And so I think that one of the important things that I'd like to kind of reiterate or emphasize through this discussion is gathering all of this information and understanding it and understanding the push and pull between potential benefits and drawbacks really needs to be thoughtfully considered as we move forward and make some decisions. Having said that, we do have what we believe is an opportunity to have a conversation about some more expedient action, specifically around downtown. And so one of the things that Mr. Casey touched on towards the end of his presentation was the importance of having a complete system as part of the conversation around parking needs. And so when we look at land use and we look at mobility, one provides the conduit between the others. And so we know that people have origins and we have destinations. They live somewhere and they work somewhere, or they need to go to school, or they need to go to wherever their destination is. And so all of our plans are encouraging people to try and use the personal vehicles for fewer and fewer of those trips. And so with that, we've looked at areas in our primary urban center and our other urban centers where we can provide more compact land use, which has better integration and provides our residents with more seamless access to their daily needs. And so with the downtown primary urban center in particular, we have discussed this through city plan and the creation of that, and acknowledged much of the already built environment for walking, biking, and transit, and have identified that that is an area where requirements for parking may not be as essential. And so we have a report right now outlining an option that aligns with city plan to eliminate parking requirements in our primary urban center, with other secondary options that are more in line with what the province has mandated in other areas as associated with transit hubs. And that is a very sort of simplified buffer around the transit exchange. And the assumption being that, well, if you're within 400 meters, then you have access to it. And it's, there's some circumstances when it's probably worth consideration, but it's a very simplified perspective, and I think that our identification of transit exchanges in city plan and the associated land use around them is far more informed and would likely land on a much more successful outcome. We have also identified an in-between option where we eliminate all of the parking requirements in that 400-meter buffer. So we've got ranging from what's identified in city plan that aligns with the primary urban center down to what the province could very well identify as part of their pre-existing legislation when the transit exchange is commissioned. And so there's a lot of complex pieces at play, and I'm hoping I've captured the integration with land use, but I'll look to Ms. Rowett for corrections or supporting comments, but then open to discussion around that.
And we do have 4 delegations, so we'll get on to that too. Ms. Rowett, did you have anything to add?
Sure. Thank you. I think Mr. Rose covered all of the bases there. The only additional context that I wanted to add is, and I think he put it very well, the careful consideration of transit-oriented areas. So the methodology that was bestowed on us by the province, of course, being a very rigid and inflexible approach to where parking minimums are eliminated and where, in fact, we cannot prohibit up to certain stories of buildings, so building heights being more permissive up to 6 or 10 stories, as well as additional densities. And so I think that's just something to note, that as we do consider how we approach parking management, possibly eliminating parking minimums, whether it be throughout the city or in strategic locations, is just to be aware of that methodology and also considering the impacts of that.
Okay, there's a question, Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. Through you to Ms., I was going to say your first name and I won't, but anyhow, Rowett. Is this the same report that the Accessibility and Diversity Committee got because they were opposed to the parking minimums because it has such an impact on those with accessibility issues? Or was that a different one?
I don't believe that's the same.
Do you know, Mr. Rose? I think you were the one that came to speak.
So through the chair, I believe that was actually the small scale housing presentation that was discussed.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Anything else to add, Ms. Rowe? Okay. Mr. Holm?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Just maybe briefly to, obviously, just to keep in perspective to city plan, the official community plan also drives servicing considerations in addition to transportation infrastructure decisions and direction. So that's important to keep in mind too, as Ms. Rowe had mentioned, the TOA areas identified by the province, don't really consider necessarily the servicing necessary to support development. Transportation is critically linked to land use and is very important to consider in conjunction with land use, but we also have all of the underground utilities and all the services that go into supporting housing and other uses that we plan, and Mr. Sims' team and others do a lot of work, and council makes decisions around future servicing implications and land use to make sure that we're making efficient use of services, and we're deciding to invest appropriately to service those areas. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Okay, if council's ready, I'd like to invite our delegations to speak. We'll start with Michael. It's pronounced Basila? Vasily. Oh. Sorry about that, Michael. Say it for the audience if you could, please, just so it's on record.
Thank you. I'll see if anyone else is coming up. I'm here first. Perfect. Hi, everyone. Through your chair and council, hi, my name is Michael Basili, director of Strong Towns Nanaimo, a little group in town that advocates towards building cities for people. We're actually here to speak in support of staff recommendation to eliminate parking mandates in our primary urban node downtown. I want to preface this by saying a lot of people who come up to give delegations on parking are pretty irate usually, and the discourse isn't as productive as I'd like. We're coming from a place of profound thanks and gratitude for both working with staff and council, engaging such a complex issue like parking. I know it's incredibly contentious. Everyone has, I think Mr. Sims himself said that if you have a driver's license, you have an opinion on parking, and I believe that's true, and that counts for us as well. We do think that at its core, what staff recommends, primarily the elimination of parking downtown, mandatory parking mandates downtown, aligns directly with a city plan, which had broad engagement with the city's residents for years. It aligns with our desire, and not just as a group, but as citizens of a connected community where people have transportation options, where our city is more connected in terms of community, where land use is better delegated and managed by the city itself. I think the broad approach that the city is trying to take right now, especially with through consulting with Urban Systems, is to sort of expand the management capabilities of the city for our parking resources. As was said before, our curb street parking is a public resource that is scarce, and as Armstrong alluded to, when these things are built and commissioned initially, they're typically free in the sense that they exist and people can park and live their life. As our city naturally densifies and people move in, competing uses for these lands emerge, and then it's the job of the city to step in and introduce management of that resource. That is the direction that the province is going, it's the direction that the city is going outside of parking sort of reform. But we're saying that we're incredibly supportive of what the efforts that the city is trying to accomplish here. At its core, again, we want to just thank everyone here right now for engaging with us. And I just want to say that we had our own independent report before Urban Systems, and I'm I don't know if any of you have read it, it's quite long and annoying, but in it we recommended, of course, full-scale elimination or the expansion of transit-oriented areas through corridors, or transit-oriented corridors. While we still, in our heart's heart, desire those sorts of outcomes, I think this is an incredibly powerful first step that our city can take to put people over parking. Again, thank you so much.
Good, thank you so much. I'll see, any questions by council? Thank you so much, and right on time, very good, thank you. Okay, our next speaker is Julian West.
Hello, can everyone see me and hear me?
Oh, there you are, good. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor, councilors, and committee members. Yes, I am Julian West.
Mr. West,
thank
I
you
should have said to you, I apologize. I should have said you'll have 5 minutes to speak.
Yes, okay. And I see you've got my slides up there, which is great. Thank you for making time to hear me today. I am the owner and principal of Urban Thrive. I'm also a former resident of Nanaimo, and I earned my degree at Vancouver Island University. And I used to bike the Parkway Trail every day to class and to work, and I remember those days fondly. Today, I'm a social enterprise housing developer, and I specialize in car-free housing in the core Victoria area. As this group considers local policies for parking, I have 2 points I want to make. First is that there is no magic number for the right amount of parking. Making an informed decision is very important, but no amount of analysis will give you the right answer. These decisions around parking and how much should be required are decisions that shape people's lives and shape the future of our communities, which is very much about leadership and vision. When we require parking for our home, we are forcing people to make a significant investment in one mode of transportation. And that incentivizes more driving and disincentivizes every other mode of transportation, which has significant implications environmentally, socially, and economically. The second point I want to make is that every design decision has trade-offs, especially when it comes to land development. And nowhere is this more apparent than when it comes to parking policy. So I've got a simple model, and I've got 2 examples that I'd like to share to illustrate this. Next slide, please. I believe I don't have control of this. There we go. Yeah, thank you. So this is the design triad. In any land development, you can choose 2 of these, but you can't have all 3. Next slide, please. With single detached housing, you get generally lots of green space and lots of parking, but only a small amount of housing. Next slide, please. With conventional multifamily housing, you generally get lots of housing and lots of parking, but only a tiny amount of green space. Next slide, please. With car-free housing, you get lots of housing and lots of green space, and that's good for a host of reasons, which I'll illustrate here. Next slide, please. This is a project we have in Victoria. It's a single lot houseplex development, which provides 6 homes, 4 3-bedrooms and 2 2-bedrooms. Next slide, please. Construction's well underway. We've had a huge amount of demand for this project, and residents are going to move in the spring. Next slide, please. And this is a side-by-side comparison with another houseplex in Victoria on a similarly sized lot. And the main difference between the 2 is quite apparent. In the right side example, you can see almost all of the exterior space is used up by the drive aisle and parking in the rear. And that's all it's effectively good for, which is storing vehicles. Conversely, our project not only has wicked bike storage, an electric car share vehicle in a wonderfully walkable, bikeable community, we've got 7 trees, we've got more than 260 plants in the landscape plan, a nature playground, a picnic table, a bunch of seating options, interactive landscaping features, and more. This is a space for kids to play, for hosting birthday parties, relaxing, reading books. This is fundamentally a people-centered space. Next slide, please. Another example, so this is sort of a typical double-row townhouse development where you've got housing on 2 sides and then a drive aisle down the middle. While you occasionally might see a kid kicking a ball around here, this is mostly dead space used for navigating cars into garages. Next slide, please. Conversely, here's another project we have in Victoria that we're breaking ground on next year. Instead of a drive aisle, we have a courtyard. Every home has a front door into this space. We've got 19 trees and more than 800 plants. There are multiple distinct areas for people to socialize with lots of seating options. The upper breezeway connects to the courtyard. We've got kids' play features integrated
1 minute
throughout.
left.
Thank you. Next slide, please. This is fundamentally different, and this is what you lose when you require parking. Next slide, please. Everything is a trade-off. There is no magic right amount of parking. Yes, parking makes it more convenient for drivers, but you have to understand what the costs are. When you choose to require parking, you choose less trees, less green space, less community-friendly spaces, less child-friendly spaces, and you make and encourage more traffic, more congestion, more emissions, more road injuries and fatalities. These are questions of vision and leadership and where you want to go as a community. And these decisions shape how people live and shapes the future of your community. And that's all for me today. Thank you.
Wow, right on time. Mr. West, we do have some questions. Councillor Armstrong, to start.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very good. Are you able to offer these at a lower price, or if you're doing rentals, are they going out at a lower price? Because we quite often hear that, but quite often we find that they're going for the same price.
This is actually a really, really complex question. So I'll give you a general answer, and then I'm happy to dig into any more aspects of it that you like. So all of our homes are for ownership. And we actually currently have, can you guys hear and see me again?
Yes.
I went out for a minute.
Yep.
Yeah, okay, good. So we actually currently have a program where we provide our homes at $150,000 less for a 3-bedroom home compared to a conventional home with parking. That is it's a unique situation because we are a social enterprise housing developer, and I wouldn't expect all developers to do the same thing. But the only way we're able to provide that is because of our car-free housing models. And there's different aspects to unpack here. So there's parking certainly increases the cost of producing housing. And that will vary depending on the development, whether you're talking about surface parking or underground parking. And generally, it does affect the market value determined by supply and demand of the market of what the value of that home will be. And generally, there's been a few analyses done in the city of Victoria, and the average is around $50,000 for a parking spot in terms of the difference in market value. But there's, that's a very sort of cursory high level sort of number put on it. And part of the challenge is it becomes an apples and oranges comparison. So if you've looked at either of the two examples I provided, the type of housing we're providing is actually fundamentally different. And we're actually adding a lot of value in other ways through additional green space and this sort of more community-centric design, which would, all else being equal, increase the value of those homes. So it's more of a shifting of priority and shifting of value in those developments, and how the market would respond to differences in parking policy can vary quite a bit.
I think also it would be fair to say that you're also responding to some consumers' requests for that type of development, correct?
Yeah. So we have, we certainly have a following behind what we do. So we have one project in pre-sales right now, and we have another that's just completing construction, and we're selling all of these homes sort of off the market. Like, we didn't have to go and do expensive marketing campaigns or hire expensive real estate agents, and we're saving a lot of costs because people have come to us, and what we do is unique, and it resonates with them. And so that's kind of like a market advantage that we have because we're fulfilling a need that's currently not being met.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your presentation.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Mayor Krog.
Thank you very much, Chair. And following along somewhat on what Councillor Armstrong's had to say, so for practical purposes, you don't have to engage in marketing campaigns. There's no real estate fees involved, the usual things. With respect to the people you're marketing to, I take it it's going to be by way of strata title. Is that correct?
Correct.
And is there any restriction on resale once people have purchased it as a strata title? Is there some time period like Co-op Housing or Habitat for Humanity or something like that where you're limited as to what you can do when it comes to disposition to a second owner, if you will?
No, and this is actually something we've explored quite extensively, and we didn't find any kind of legal mechanism that we could implement that would effectively do that. Then you guys do, as a municipality, you do through street parking management and how that's structured, but not anything that I'm able to implement through current provincial and local government regulation.
Thank you, because I think that's always been one of the issues, if you will, around what I will call lower cost housing that fits, I won't call it a niche marketplace because it's growing, but historically people who are prepared to live in a urban area without the benefit of the private automobile. Thanks very much for the presentation. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other questions? We'll move on then to our next delegation. Thank you, Mr. West. The next speaker is Scott Ebbett. Coming in by Zoom.
Hello,
by
everyone.
chance.
You can hear me? Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Scott Ebbett. I'm coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand. So I've been invited to speak about some innovative, groundbreaking planning and parking reform changes that have happened in New Zealand over the past 10 years or so. So I do have a presentation there.
And
yeah, I apologise.
You know that you've got 5 minutes, and I'll let you know when you've got 1 minute left.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
so
you.
this presentation is a bit long, so we're going to have to skip through fairly quickly. If you could just skip forward a couple. Yeah, so just a summary, one more slide, please. Just a summary. So Auckland is the largest city in New Zealand, and around 15 years ago, there was a merger of a lot of councils within Auckland into one. And so this gave a golden opportunity to rewrite the planning rule book in Auckland. And there was a big push to allow for more housing and also a big push to reform the minimum parking requirements. So I'll talk more about that later. Next slide, please. And this, the second part I'll talk about is the sort of national, the whole of New Zealand changes that the New Zealand government brought in. And this is really sort of piggybacking on the success of the Auckland changes to create a lot more housing and reform these minimum parking requirements. So if we could just skip forward to slide 13. So the changes in Auckland. So the Auckland is a very fast growing city, and there was a need to create more land for housing or more infill of housing. There was a target for 70% of new housing in the Auckland region to occur within the existing boundaries. And this unitary plan, which we call it, that removed minimum parking requirements in all of the high density and medium density and mixed use residential zones and all business zones. So there was a push to go further with the minimum parking requirements, but in the end it was defined, so no minimum parking requirements in those zones. So next slide, please. So this was an immediate success in Auckland. There was that dwelling consents really took off. You can see the bottom right there. In those upzoned areas, there's a huge lift in dwelling consents, and 82% of housing consents in Auckland were within the existing urban area. Next slide, please. Next one. So there's some really interesting housing built in Auckland under these changes. So this is an example where one family home was replaced with 33 apartments. There was only 2 parking spaces, and they're for car share vehicles, and there's a large bike parking garage there. Next slide, please. There's a lot of sort of medium density housing going in around the region, some with parking, some without. Next slide, please. And just one more example there of 21 apartments, car share available in this development, and the developer actually gave a free e-bike with every purchase of every unit in this development. So there's some really interesting builds going on in Auckland with these new planning regulations. Next slide, please. You could just skip forward. So these national changes, this was really, the government was on big pressure to deal with housing affordability. It was a huge issue in New Zealand. So they wrote a national policy statement on urban development that required councils around the country to allow for much, much higher densities. So up to 6 stories allowed around walking catchments to existing town centres and frequent public transit. And this national policy statement also removed the ability for councils to have a minimum parking requirement. So minimum parking requirements were effectively gone in New Zealand under this. And I believe we're the first country in the world to bring this in. Next slide, please. I think I'm really running out of time now. So
we've got a minute left.
A minute left, okay. So yeah, as I said before, house price to income ratios in New Zealand were one of the highest in the world. And it was a real problem that needed to be addressed. So removing minimum parking requirements became a sort of land use housing issue rather than a transport issue. And this allowed much more success in bringing this in and less public debate because it was dealing with this critical housing issue. Next slide, please. PwC was also engaged to do an economic evaluation of removing minimum parking requirements, and they went to a lot of research and they determined that removing these rules had a benefit cost ratio of 8.6, so there were 8 times as many benefits as costs. So this is sort of some of the evidence that the government had. Next slide, please. Okay, we can just skip forward. So yeah, in Auckland, the purple area is all the land that was upzoned in these changes. Yeah, next slide, please.
We'll get you to bring this to a close too, please.
Yeah. So this is Wellington, and effectively this part of Wellington, all of that brown area became an upzoned area that allowed for 6 stories. And this was also the first city in New Zealand to remove minimum parking requirements. And they saw an explosion of new residential growth. Here, if you go to the next slide. And that minimum parking rate, that top left graph, it went from 1 car park per unit. After the change, it dropped down to about half in 2022. But in 2023, it started to come back up. And that's really the market sort of providing the right level of parking and developers understanding what is a car park worth and making those trade-offs to how much parking to provide in their developments. And the bottom graph there is the closer to public transit, the less parking is provided, and the further from public transit, the more parking. So rather than having a blunt minimum rule, developers can make their own decisions based on a range of factors on how much parking. So I'm probably out of time, but this has been a successful change in New Zealand, and house prices since these changes went in have fallen across the country. I mean, there's a range of factors for that, but it's really sort of turbocharged the ability to build more housing in existing areas, and removing the minimum parking requirements has given that ability for flexibility and innovation in these developments. So yeah, I'll wrap it up there, but happy to take some questions.
Thank you. We may have some questions. I have one for you to start with. Mr. Abbott, how do you, now that you've been doing this for a while, how do you find the general public is about this lack of parking in places that they used to be able to park at? What's the feeling around?
Yeah, so I guess it's important to note that there's not always a lack of parking. It's now a market-based decision, and there's developments. Most developments are built with parking in Auckland and New Zealand because we're probably similar. We're not Europe. We don't have great public transit, but yeah, certainly in some areas there are housing built with very little parking, and it does increase the pressure on public streets. There's more parking on the street. Auckland Transport, where I live, have a very sort of proactive program of parking management, and I think the speaker earlier on talked about that. It really needs to be coupled with strong public parking management to deal with those impacts. and they map out their networks, so cycle networks and public transit networks along streets, so developers and the public know that certain streets will not have parking and certain streets will have parking, and it'll be managed in a certain way. So I think it's important for developers to know those things to factor in their decisions on how much to provide.
Okay. And just when you talk about the strong parking management, are you talking about parking tickets?
No, more about setting limits like price parking on curbside parking, or time limits, or in some places residential zones. It's sort of that curbside management, setting the rules on the management of parking space.
Okay, that's helpful. Any other questions of council? Mr. Abbott, thank you so much. We wish we were there. It's probably a little warmer where you are, so go out and enjoy that warm weather. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, and our final delegation is Darren Moss. And Mr. Moss, you know the routine. 5 minutes, and I'll let you know when there's a minute left. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm here today on behalf of Planning, Design, Development, and AMO. We were approached by Mike and his group to provide commentary on their strategies and their thoughts around parking. And at our last meeting, we had a good discussion about the proposed reduction or removal of parking requirements in the downtown core, and we are supportive of that idea. I think it's important to note that we're supportive of that idea, with the idea that it has to happen with deliberate effort to empower other modes of transportation. There's the ones we know about, there's cycling, e-bikes, walk, transit, and there's the ones we don't know about that'll be here in 40 years that we can't even imagine. And so creating room for those as we remove restrictions is what we're in support of. And I was sitting in the crowd listening to everybody, and I think that there's a lot of great thoughts that have come up, and I'm trying to distill them in my head. And so what I've come up with is, we're talking about a very complex challenge when we start to rattle down the details, but it's not so complex up here. And I think City Plan does a wonderful job of it. What we want for the future is a society that's less dependent on single traffic vehicle traffic. That's the point. And so what we're talking about now is what City Council and staff can do to enable that change to happen. When we remove parking requirements from the downtown core, we're not saying don't park. We're not saying developers would, should, or could do that, because developers won't be in business very long if we build product that people don't want. As Councillor Armstrong was alluding to, it's a challenge in some rental markets. What we're really doing is just saying we're going to allow flexibility for new types of developments to explore the market. And the risk of that, yes, there's some risk that public will be inconvenienced in that process, but over time, it's the development community that will adapt to the current needs. And I think that's what we heard from the presenter from New Zealand, is that they went too far and they bounced back. We've heard the same thing from Councillor Armstrong. And what happens in that scenario is the developer will still need to move that product, which means they will lower the price. So if they have something they get wrong, we will create lower priced units, which will service some of our community. We will adapt, they will adapt, and we'll end up with different pieces. So I applaud the effort of everyone in this room to remove a regulatory constraint that might reduce creativity. And yes, we support it. And I would also ask that as we go through this process, that we explore the opportunities it opens up for existing buildings. So especially in our downtown core.
Okay.
So that's it.
Stay
Thank
for
you.
some questions.
Okay.
Let's start with Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Moss. Appreciate your time again. As you stated, you as a developer, you're going to do your homework first, right? So you're not going to build something where you know that people are not going to go there because they do want parking. Is that correct? Like you're going to do your homework. You're going to know if there's a market and how much. I know it's a guessing game, but you're going to do an assessment as to, can I get away with 20 spots versus 100? Is that correct?
Yeah, honest answer, I'm going to do everything I can, and I'm going to get it wrong sometimes.
Yeah.
But definitely it's in my best interest as a developer to understand the market needs and the demographic I'm trying to service, 100%.
And as you said, at the end of the day, if you don't have enough parking, it's going to be you that pays the price. It's not going to be anybody else, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Councillor Gesselbrook, and then Councillor Manley.
Thanks, Chair. Through you, just at the end there, you mentioned just sort of the impacts on current developments, with this change, and can you just expand a little bit more on that? And
yeah, happy to. In the current off-street parking bylaw, there are requirements when you change use or different pieces or expand an existing building, and often a constraint that we come up against is when you make a significant change or a change of use in a building, we come against parking again. Parking really does become, in our current bylaws, the first thought that we go to when we're planning our developments. And so if in certain high-density nodes we decide to make that not the planning tool, it'll offer other opportunities for new businesses, smaller expansions, and those kind of things to happen at the same time, not just new development.
okay, thank you. Can I ask
Sure.
staff's input just on that question after? Okay, thanks.
Maybe we'll hold that thought for a moment. Councillor Manley?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I just have a quick question, just for the sake of the audience. Who does your group represent in the community? Plan development, design development, and IMO. Are you a cross section of developers that are bringing these views to council?
Through the chair, Planning, Design, Development, and IMO is actually a volunteer group that stands on its own, that is a representation of 6 to 7 people. As one of our subcommittees at the Nanaimo Development Group, that group represents about 60 consultants and developers in the community. For the comments today, it's at the board level. So it's the PDDM board. We haven't polled the Nanaimo Development Group membership on this. This came through just at the board level.
And do you have a sense of what other developers in the community think of this reducing of parking minimums in our downtown core?
Definitely a sense. We haven't polled them, but certainly I think most developers that we deal with would welcome the chance to be creative and have that ability. But again, as discussed, I don't believe you'll find many zero-parked developments coming forward from developers looking to sell or rent at this point in time. Hopefully, as we get different modes of transportation, you see more of those. And there are some sites in Nanaimo that would make a lot of sense for today, but they're few and far between.
Yeah, but it seems like it's putting it in the hands of developers to do your own market research, figure out who you're selling these units to as you're planning to develop them. So it seems like it's a good kind of free market approach to me. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, only that I would say it's not in the hands of the developer so much. I think it really is in the hands of the market. Developers take their best guess going forward. It's the market that will tell us whether we're right or not.
Thank you.
Mr. Moss, can you tell me, do you think this would have, these changes, will they have any concerns to the current market of what is out there right now, the current buildings? Would it affect them in any way?
Yeah, I'm trying to think through that comment. So I believe that every change will have people who enjoy it and people who enjoy it less. And if you reduce the on-site parking for a building, it will have an impact on street parking and curbside management, as has been discussed. And there will be people that don't like that. And so change is never fully embraced by everybody, but I think certain change is worth the pain it goes through to get to the end result.
Thank you so much. Okay, if there are no other questions, thank you very much for being here, and don't go away. We might have some more for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, now I know Councillor Guestbrook had a question for staff. Did staff want to add any more information? There is a motion to be put on the floor, but did you want to add any more, or can I go to Councillor Guestbrook?
Me too.
Councillor Guestbrook first, and then Councillor Armstrong. No, I'm not.
Thanks, Chair, through you. Following up, in terms of, say, option 1, with the downtown, removing parking minimums for residential and commercial, how does that impact current buildings, for example, for change of use, and that, does it actually, will it not will it apply to them as well, and open up sort of more possibility?
Through the chair, maybe I'll start and I'll turn it over to staff. I think in this question, it's important to recognize that we haven't had commercial parking requirements downtown for the majority of our properties for decades. So when you're asking the question about what's the impact, I would say that when you have a change of use in a building in the downtown, historically, you haven't had parking be a limiting factor in whether that, or a barrier to the change in use, where if you have it in a suburban area right now under our bylaw or in another part of the city, it does become a factor in the change of use of that building. So hasn't been historically downtown. So this will not see an immediate impact on the downtown because it's been that way for a considerable period of time.
Okay, and that goes for residential as well, like say for example, I mean, is there cases where there's residential buildings and if there's no parking minimums, like, oh, wow, we can put a few more units on this thing now?
Sorry, you're right. So if it's residential requirement if it's a previously existing commercial building going to residential, right now there is a parking requirement. So this bylaw would actually make it easier to do that in the downtown core. I was talking more of the change of use we see often in commercial places where somebody would have went from a retail store to a restaurant or something that would have had a different parking requirement. In the downtown, it's not been an issue for decades because there's been no parking.
Awesome, thanks.
Councillor Armstrong?
Thank you. I guess my question and concern is we had a petition from over 70 seniors at the low cost, or the subsidized over on Prudhoe, that they don't have enough parking because we assume because of that, and they're not mobile, they need their cars, they feel socially isolated now because their families can't come because there's no place to park. Even though the bus stop is 2 blocks away, they can't get there because there's a lot of mobility issues. Then we had numerous seniors again from Selby Street, again with the same concerns that there's not enough parking, especially for those with mobility issues. My concern about this is there a way that we could have an exception for buildings that are going to cater to seniors, that they need to have minimum parkings? Because that's where my big concern comes in. I'm not worried about people that are mobile or younger people or people that, you know, have those options. But when you hear from the seniors, and I've been to 2 or 3 different meetings at Selby Street, I've been to one at Prudhoe, and they're just devastated. Like, their family can't come to visit, they can't even get carrieds because there's no parking. So is there a way that we could have an exception for them, or could they apply for an exception? Well, I guess they would do it, but like I would like to see minimums for that type of development, for seniors development. If somebody could comment to that, and if, I don't know if we can open it to our guest speaker. I don't know if he would have the answers if staff doesn't.
Well, let staff respond first. Mr. Rose?
Sure, through the chair. I would say there's probably something that could be discussed. I think I would also highlight, though, that as Mr. Moss and several others highlighted, this eliminates the minimum. It doesn't talk about what the applicant could provide. And so if the applicant knows their market, under this circumstance, the expectation would be that they would understand the needs of that. And so, so I guess it's sort of qualifying the answer. Yes, it could be, but it also it sort of contradicts the notion of free market.
I guess my concern comes in is because we assume that they would know the market, but we heard loud and loud that BC Housing didn't know their market in that particular case because, you know, and again, and this is my bias from policing, I know that most seniors don't want to give up their driver's license. It's the last thing they do. Even those that are poor keep their card to the last minute because it's independence. And a lot of senior women are scared to go on the bus because a lot of stuff happens on a bus. And I guess even I take a look at Berwick, which is more, they don't have enough parking, so now they're actually building an underground parking to get more. So I think we're, I don't know if it's the market or whatever, don't understand the needs of seniors, and then they're really paying the price for it. So those are just my thoughts, and I can discuss it later, but thank you for your answer.
Mr. Lindsay? Mr. Lindsay, you wanted to respond?
I think, I'm just going to add through the chair, I think this is an important point. I mean, council's, you know, being progressive in making these changes at the downtown, and whether it's seniors housing or residential, I think removing parking requirements that are a response from the market doesn't mean that council's not going to get comments from future residents or tenants that put additional pressure on parkades and on-street parking and demand for that. So I think the examples you've talked about are 2 real examples in the downtown. seniors. I think there's just has to be an awareness and a recognition that when you do this, there is going to be the odd person who still comes with the, request that there be parking, and that there's not enough parking. So I think there should be eyes wide open that if we're doing this, that there will come those corresponding kind of operational complaints that will come as people get used to this.
Okay. Councillor Armstrong, that answered your question? Any other questions? There is an actual staff recommendation if someone wishes to move it. Councillor Hemmons wishes to move it. Is there a seconder?
Seconded.
Councillor Gesselbruck to second. That is the recommended motion, the staff recommendation that the motion that the Governance and Priorities Committee recommend that Council direct staff to amend the off-street parking regulations bylaw 2018 number 7266 to eliminate all minimum parking requirements for all uses within the downtown urban center. Okay, any other comments? Mayor Krog?
Thank you very much. You don't have to look far around the world, and I think particularly of Hong Kong, only because we've had so much immigration from China in the last couple of decades. The reality is that people who live in Hong Kong, by and large, don't own automobiles. There is no alternative. It's practical. The City of London charges you what many of us would think are outrageous amounts of money to bring a car into the urban center. That's happening all over the world. Frankly, having grown up in Coombs, BC, I have a certain fondness for the concept of rural living, but appreciate that the vast majority of the planet live in urban areas. Basically giving an opportunity for housing to be constructed in our downtown core where there will be no provision for an automobile, I think is a choice, quote unquote, for the marketplace, and a choice to some extent along the lines of what Councillor Armstrong's reminded us for nonprofit housing providers to make that choice as well. And if you choose to move into a residential complex that has no parking, you've made your choice. And if that isn't a suitable choice, then put pressure on the government to build some housing someplace else where you actually have an opportunity to retain or maintain an automobile. So I think it's necessary. Its time has come. It's progressive. I will watch with interest how it develops and see how the marketplace responds in terms of the number of units that will be constructed. But my vision of this community's downtown has been for a very long time that it's a place where you could hopefully, if you chose to, live, work, survive, get the services you need in an urban context without the necessity of an automobile, subject, of course, to those accessibility, disability issues that Councillor Armstrong pointed out. So I'm certainly going to be supporting the motion.
Okay, Councillor Gesselbruck?
I think the mayor spoke quite eloquently to the reasons for moving ahead with this. I think, the downtown is the obvious spot to start doing this, and we've already had it imposed in other nodes in the city. I think, we'd probably even be a little bit more adventurous in opening up in other areas, but this is a very reasonable first stop. And I think ultimately, I think one of the presenters spoke to this, it just removes a barrier for creativity. Ultimately, the market is going to decide where parking and how much parking makes sense, and it will be driven by numerous different factors, and really this is just getting the municipality out of the way of probably a more sensitive assessment of what's needed. Thank you.
Councillor Armstrong?
Thank you. I've done a lot of research on this, a lot of thinking, and looking at my own viewpoints on it. I think now the city's got a lot of buildings that do have a lot of parking now, so there is options available for people. And going against my ingrained nature, which I've always gone for, is I've always not liked to see no parking, but I believe in this downtown core area, I don't see it as a big detriment. So I will be voting in favor of this to see how it works out and let the market decide. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Thorpe.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Not to be confused with former Councillor Sherry, I don't think I can support this. I appreciate the presentations that we've had, and I understand the rationale of what's being proposed. I think what's in my mind partly is the fact that, as we heard in the first part of our meeting today, our city is undergoing right now a comprehensive parking conditions study, which will be completed, I understand, next year. And to me, this plays in as a part of what we'll find out from that study. So I'm not in a big rush to do any major change to our downtown philosophy yet. I'd like to point out for those listening that the staff report that we have includes 3 options. The one that's being recommended is to eliminate the parking minimum requirements for all uses within the downtown urban center. There is a second option to eliminate the minimum requirements for all uses within a 400-meter radius of the future downtown transit exchange. And the third option is to eliminate the minimum parking requirements for residential uses only within a 400-meter radius of the transit exchange. And I suppose there would be a fourth option, which would be to do nothing. I might be prepared to support option 2 or 3, but at this point, I think we're being a little bit premature. And I note that in all 3 options that staff have presented with us, it points out as a disadvantage that our decision will increase demand for parking on street and within downtown parking facilities. That's a consequence. I think we have to take into account these possible consequences and see how we're going to deal with them before we make decisions moving forward. So that's my rationale of holding off on support for this at the time. Again, I understand the reasoning, and I think I would prefer to see more consultation with the development community. It is market-driven, and I think we should allow the market to decide. I'm not sure that we should be imposing minimums at this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Councillor Thorpe. Question to staff. So if this goes forward and the downtown transit exchange trips our designation for downtown to become a transit-oriented area, this would cover more geography than that TOA, correct? So we're going broader. It's that the TOA would allow height to happen. Okay, I'm seeing nods. Thank you. Just for my own clarity.
Mr. Rose? Yes. Or Ms. Rout? Who's going to address it?
Sure. Through the chair, I'll try to speak to Councillor Hemmons' question.
Thank you, Mr. Hall.
So there's not a perfect alignment of, so the options 2 and 3 are based on the future transit exchange location and overlaying the provincial TOA concentric ring approach. So it's just purely a circle of 400 meters from the centered on the future transit exchange. So there's not a perfect overlap between the two. So sorry, thank you for bringing that up on the screen. You can see the concentric ring, the TOA approach actually extends to the south outside of the primary urban center. But then the area recommended in option 1, the primary urban center extends quite a bit farther to the north and to the west as well.
Thank you. I didn't actually realize that distinction, and I wonder if Councillor Thorpe knew that, that this is a different area being covered. My second question is, if this goes forward today, what will be the communication to developers? How will we communicate this change to community and folks who this will impact?
Thank you, through the chair again. Through the amendments to the parking bylaw, my understanding would require a public hearing. As well, we can communicate through our development liaison groups as well, and I'm sure we'd do a media release as well. If hopefully that answers the question. Thanks.
It does. Thank you. And I move the motion. I'm in support. Like the mayor, I believe this is the time for it. I really liked Mr. Moss's commentary that developers invite being creative. So thank you for this report.
If there are no other comments, I'll just add my own. The one thing that you realize about Nanaimo is it still feels like a small community, but it's not. And certainly in the downtown area, we are really trying to encourage strong, beautiful development. And what we need to be is more inventive and more creative, and this option allows that. And I think there could be some pinch points, definitely, in the future, but it's a good start, and we can see how it goes. And I look forward to the report coming out later on, but I'm in favor of this now. So if there's no other comments, I'll call the question then. All those in favor? And opposed? Councillor Thorpe is opposed. Motion carries. Thank you so much, everyone. That was a great debate. Okay, we'll move on to question period. Is there anyone? Okay. Move adjournment by Councillor Hemmons. Mayor Krog seconds. All those in favor? Motion is carried. Thank you, everyone.